The War Prevention Initiative is a nonprofit that believes that war is in fact preventable through education, talks, lectures, and mediation. The War Prevention Initiative dispenses the core values of nonviolence, empathy, planetary loyalty, and moral imagination to make real a world that is beyond war by 2030. We have in the studio to talk about the North and South Korean conflict, adjunct faculty professor in the Conflict Resolution Program at Portland State University and director of the War Prevention Initiative, Dr. Patrick Hiller. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Patrick, nice to have you here. We've been at war all my life. My country has. What's changing that you can eliminate this with your initiative?
Well, we are now at a stage in human history where we actually have figured out what the viable alternatives are to war and violence. I think over history many of the peace advocates have understood it right, but now we actually have peace research, peace science to support a lot of that, and really a professionalized field of peace building.
Well, let me follow up. What are the viable alternatives to war?
Well, one of the key alternatives right now, if we're looking especially at the situation in North Korea, is diplomacy. And it works. It's sometimes messy, it takes long, but it is preferable to war.
Speaking of diplomacy, what do you think of Michael Pence not really participating in some of those diplomatic steps during the Olympics?
Well, we have a textbook definition for what he did during the Olympics. We call that a spoiler to peace processes. So while there was really a very hopeful initiative by the Koreans, both sides, and high-level engagement and talks, Pence visited the Olympics to undermine those, and he had no objective to make that work. And as I said, we call that a spoiler, so our job is to hopefully undermine those spoiling efforts that are taking place there.
When you say our job, you mean the initiative's job, your group, or?
Peace advocates in general,
Okay.
Diplomats, but also we are part of a very large network of peace professional organizations, peace advocacy organizations, who are now mobilizing to try to prevent war with North Korea.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just curious about techniques of undermining said spoilers.
Well, it is changing the narrative, showing what the realities are, providing, for example, insights into the viable diplomatic alternatives instead of talking only about war and sanctions that are very harmful to many people.
Patrick, it looks like the president is dismantling our State Department, and we are losing our ability to conduct diplomacy. Is that right? Are you observing that? What do you think?
Yeah, that is certainly a concern that we have, because the people in the State Department, by definition of what they do around the world, is there are diplomats, and there are not enough anymore. Positions are not filled. So there is a dire need right now, for real diplomats to address the crises.
So if the solution is to have more diplomacy, where is that diplomacy? Who's going to do that? Who's doing that work?
Well, right now the Koreans themselves are doing very good work there. So maybe this is a time for the U.S. to let the Koreans really talk, because every time they talk, that means at that time there are no threats, no missiles, and no escalation. So talking is de-escalation, and we just need to let that process unfold.
And on your War Prevention Initiative, it lists moral imagination as part of its core values. What is moral imagination?
Well, this is a broader value that guides our work here, and it really makes us think beyond just the immediately tangible in all conflicts and to be a little bit more creative. And if we apply it to North Korea, it means we need to start envisioning a landscape beyond violence, beyond war. So we need to start envisioning what does a future on the Korean Peninsula look like without war, without nuclear weapons. And again, I want to emphasize the key actors to implement that are the Koreans themselves.
So what do you envision in that future for the Korean Peninsula? What is that future?
Well, I do not want to envision the future for the Koreans themselves, But I do want to emphasize that a denuclearized North Korea is in everyone's interest. So is a denuclearized United States, China, Russia, all the nuclear nations, right? But we need to, as a conflict resolution professional now, I would look at the conflict in North Korea at where it is. So it has different stages of escalation. And last year, with the threats from both sides and the escalation with horrible tweets and this speech by our president at the United Nations, that was an escalation short of war. And now we are seeing how the Koreans are talking, and we need to build on that. And we need to extend those talks and then think about what are the next possible realistic steps, like stopping the military exercises on the Korean Peninsula, and maybe talk about a freeze for freeze initiative. So that would mean that the North Koreans would stop their missile testing, and that the US and South Koreans would stop their military exercises, which are very provocative. They contain elements like exercises for a decapitation strike. In other words, they're practicing how to conduct a regime change. And we must understand North Korea's position here. They are threatened by that.
It seems like the North Koreans have gotten credibility in or a position at the table through the development of nuclear weapons. What's the incentive for them to give that up? Why would they do that?
Right now, there is no incentive. That's the reality, and we have to face that. So that's why we have to look in diplomacy and negotiation at what are the smaller steps that we can achieve now, which is happening through that dialogue. And then once we, for example, if we achieve a freeze for freeze initiative, and we can start talking about some security assurances for the North Korean regime, economic support, aid, that is when we can start talking about the bigger issues. But putting the biggest possible issue on the table right now, that just doesn't work. That's not a reality for negotiation.
I was just seeing that it's that conflict resolution program that you're a faculty professor for. I've always imagined that being more like interpersonal. Is that true? And if so, are you just taking the skills from that and applying them to a broader world stage with that?
Our field of conflict resolution is very broad. So we teach and practice and research everything from interpersonal to international conflict. So I've had the training in all those elements, but my focus personally is on international conflicts and war prevention.
How do China and Russia figure into this? It can't be just the United States and North and South Korea, right? We have to somehow get this whole picture in balance. Is that right?
Sure, they are important actors, and again, this supports my call for diplomacy. The more actors we have involved that are engaged in talks, that have different interests, that have different incentives, the more possible solutions we have there.
Do you have any overtures with Russia and China? Maybe not yourself, but your organization? Or are you speaking with people in those places?
No, we are a fairly small organization. We work with many of the peace movement organizations and peace networks in the United States. And our focus is on our role as Americans. And I think that's a chunk that is big enough for us. So we do not focus on China and Russia there.
You're not running a little State Department in out of your office. Do you have? Are you here in Portland? You are, right?
Yeah, we're here in Portland.
You have you say you network with other peace organizations. What would be examples that we would know?
Well, so right now we are co-signatories of an Olympic Truce Action, and 135 peace organizations nationwide have signed that. Peace Action would probably be the biggest one, which is a nationwide membership peace organization. Faith-based peace organizations, Veterans for Peace are also co-signatories for that. Washington, D.C. based ones like Win Without War, very effective there. Code Pink, which is a very effective activist organization.
How does the War Prevention Initiative actively work towards its goal of having a war-free world in 2030?
We are not working with a timeline for that. I'm afraid to admit that. But we need to be guided by some vision that gives us some hope.
Moral imagination.
Exactly.
Yeah. And let's see. Is the global peace system evolving?
Excuse me?
Is there a global peace system evolving, do you feel, even though
Yes,
you're kind
yes.
of focusing on the American
Well, we focus a lot on war prevention, and right now with the North Korea crisis, we're talking very tangible prevention issues, but we've also learned through history that over the last 100 plus years, there has been something that we call a global peace system. So there are really undeniable trends happening in areas like social change, conflict transformation, and global collaboration that are very hopeful in leading us into the right direction. In other words, we don't have to start from scratch when we talk about preventing wars. We have something to build on.
Are you talking about the United Nations?
The United Nations is an example of a global collaboration effort in that global peace system. And there I obviously say we have to look at the idea of the United Nations and be open and willing to criticize the actual implementation and the structure.
We've only talked about North and South Korea. Are you looking at the Middle East, or do you look at other sources of conflict in the world and how you would resolve those conflicts?
We do. Right now, certainly the focus is on North Korea because that has, by many experts, regardless if they're, peace advocates or warmongers, they say that is a real and present danger of war. But we've been very active in informing and educating about the Iran nuclear deal a few years ago. And other than that, we look at militarism issues in our own country. Because we believe that is kind of one of the unavoidable game changers, really, to confront our nation's militarism.
Are you talking about the white supremacist sort of militarization? We see a lot of gun violence happening right now, and within our own country, that's not.
Well, there is a connection. I mean, there's a narrative there, but I mean, this goes a little bit beyond the scope of our work, but it's really that larger framework of militarism, where there are those beliefs in that, there are military solutions to most of the problems, and actually there are never military solutions to those problems.
Patrick, you have a lot to think about. How did you get into this subject area and become a specialist in this field?
Well, probably I came more out of the, a commitment to peace and justice activism. A lot of that was formed in Mexico when I lived there. And I figured out that I wanted to make a career out of that. And what I mentioned earlier, there is such a thing as a field of conflict resolution professionals. I got a degree in conflict resolution. And I'm also a very, strong advocate and cheerleader for our field. I go out and speak about how relevant our field is, that there's peace science. I say give peace science a chance, because we have research now that informs many of the practices and supports them and helps peace advocates be better advocates.
I would think that Mexico has a lot to show us in terms of resolving issues in many respects. What was your experience there?
Well, I was involved with an activist group, still are very close, I'm still very close to them, that really based their entire work on the nonviolent principles of Gandhi and others. And I learned how effective really nonviolence is in addressing conflicts, that it's very proactive, and that it is really the path that I wanted to take and needed to take, because it's the way I've experienced it there.
What do you think of the Antifa here in Portland?
We've written about that in our Peace Science Digest, which is a publication out of our War Prevention Initiative. I think I would encourage everyone who is very strongly in support of what Antifa does to think very clearly about the effectiveness or the lack thereof of those actions.
We're going to have to wrap up, but really quick, Dr. Hiller, could you give us one tip for conflict resolution that we could carry out with us after we leave KBOO and for all of our listeners?
I would now get engaged. This is not the time to sit back on the North Korea issue. Peaceaction.org, that organization is really mobilizing most, and there's ways for many people to get involved with petitions, public protest, and the kind of the basics of entry-level activism. Now is a good time.
Dr. Patrick Hiller, thanks for joining us at KBOO today.
Thanks for having me.